The word sweetheart slipped out in the middle of the crowded room, unplanned and loud. Time seemed to suspend. The noise of the party faded into a dull, distant hum. I felt the immediate, cold wash of regret, the terrifying realization of a boundary crossed. I waited for her to pull away. Instead, she stepped into the space between us. Her eyes held mine, unflinching, and a slow smile touched her lips. She didn't correct me. The dynamic shifted instantly from safe friendship to something dangerous, and the air between us charged with a sudden, heavy voltage. The evening was designed to be a masquerade of competence. My startup had rented the penthouse of the Avery building for our holiday gala, a glass box floating above the city lights. Inside, the air was thin and expensive, smelling of pine, catering, and desperation. As the founder, my role was simple: project absolute stability while internally calculating runway to the penny. Every conversation was a pitch, every laugh a negotiation. I wore a velvet suit that felt like armor, my smile pinned in place with sheer willpower. Elena was the anomaly. She wasn't tech, she wasn't finance. She was a literature teacher who wore thrifted silk with more elegance than the investors wore couture. She was my grounding wire. While I spun out over cap tables, she would remind me that the world existed outside of quarterly reviews. I had invited her as a buffer, a safe harbor in a room full of sharks. I didn't expect the harbor to suddenly feel like the deep ocean. The crisis that precipitated the slip was mundane but threatening. Richard, a board member with a predatory instinct for weakness, had cornered me near the bar. He was grilling me on user acquisition costs, his voice rising just enough to draw attention. My throat had gone dry. I was fumbling for the data, feeling the room tilt, when Elena materialized at my elbow. She didn't know our metrics, but she knew human behavior with uncanny precision. She placed a hand on Richard's arm, laughed at a joke he hadn't even made yet, and seamlessly steered the conversation toward his recent trip to Aspen. Within 2 minutes, he was beaming. Within 3, he was wandering off to find his wife, leaving me leaning against a pillar, exhaling for the first time in hours. "You," I breathed out, the adrenaline crashing into exhaustion. "You are a miracle worker." She turned to me, holding 2 fresh glasses of wine, her expression amused and soft. "He just needed to feel important," she said, her voice dropping under the noise of the crowd. "You were doing fine. I just expedited the exit." I wasn't doing fine. I was drowning. I took the wine, my fingers brushing hers. The relief was heady, almost intoxicating, mixing with the alcohol I hadn't eaten enough to absorb. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt that surge of overwhelming, reckless affection that I usually kept carefully boxed away. "Thank you. Seriously. I don't know what I'd do without you, sweetheart." The word tumbled out with the weight of a stone dropping into a canyon. It wasn't the casual honey of a waitress or the performative darling of the socialites in the room. It was heavy, possessive, and undeniably tender. I froze. The background chatter seemed to sharpen, then blur. I expected confusion. I expected her to laugh it off, to make a joke about us being an old married couple, to restore the equilibrium of our platonic contract. She didn't. Elena went still. Her eyes, usually warm and open, darkened with a sudden, sharp focus. She didn't look away. She looked right into the center of the panic rising in my chest. She placed her glass down on the high table behind her, never breaking eye contact. Then she stepped closer. It wasn't a friendly step. It was a deliberate invasion of the professional distance I had been trying to maintain all night. "You're welcome," she murmured. Her voice had dropped an octave, losing its bright social cadence. She reached out. I stopped breathing. She took the lapel of my jacket between her fingers, smoothing a wrinkle that didn't exist. The movement was slow, heavy with intent. Then her hand drifted up. Her knuckles grazed the line of my jaw, a touch so light it felt like a burn, before she adjusted my collar. The sensation was electric, a live wire touching water. "You should represent yourself with more confidence," she whispered, her mouth dangerously close to my ear. You're the most powerful person in this room. She pulled back just an inch, enough for me to see the challenge in her eyes. She hadn't recoiled from the endearment. She had caught it and pinned it to her chest. The air around us thickened, charged with a sudden, suffocating sexual tension that had no place in a boardroom discussion. I started, but my voice failed. "Drink your wine," she commanded softly. "Richard is looking back over here." She turned back to the room, her shoulder pressing firmly against mine. The party continued, the jazz played, the investors laughed, the city lights glittered. But the reality of the night had fundamentally fractured. The safe, neutral ground of our established friendship had vanished, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating precipice. The rest of the evening became a study in gravitational physics. Before that slip, Elena would usually drift through these events like a curious tourist, charming strangers on the periphery while I managed the center. But now the orbit had collapsed. She stayed within arm's reach, a constant, radiant heat source at my side. It wasn't that she was clinging. She was staking a claim. I tried to focus on the room. I had to. Closing a bridge round depended on it. I moved from a conversation with a venture capitalist to a huddle with our lead engineers, but my awareness was entirely fractured. I was hyper-aware of where she stood, how she moved. Every time I shifted my weight, she was there, mirroring me, stepping into the space I created. It felt less like support and more like being hunted, though I couldn't decide if I was the prey or the prize. The sensory details of her presence began to overwhelm the sterile, expensive atmosphere of the penthouse. The air conditioner was blasting, fighting the body heat of 200 people, but I was burning up. I could smell her perfume, a complex, dark scent of amber and old paper that I had known for years. Tonight, however, it seemed sharper, heavier. It cut through the generic floral arrangements and the metallic tang of anxiety filling the room. When she laughed at a joke made by our CFO, the sound vibrated in my chest, a low, resonant hum that made my skin prickle under the heavy velvet. She was brilliant with them, of course. She engaged the investors with a charm that was disarming because it was so clearly unstudied. She listened to a monologue about blockchain with an expression of rapt fascination, asking questions that made the speaker feel like a genius. But while she charmed them, her attention remained tethered to me. It was a dizzying, multitasking feat. She would be nodding at a potential lead investor, but her body was angled toward mine. Her foot brushed against my ankle. Her eyes would flicker to me, checking, assessing, holding that same intense, unflinching focus she had shown when I called her sweetheart. It was a private conversation happening in the silence between words, a subtext that screamed louder than the jazz band. We ended up at the bar again, waiting for sparkling water because the wine had turned into a liability. The crowd pressed in, forcing us together. The noise level was oppressive, a wall of sound. Elena leaned in to say something, bypassing the socially acceptable distance entirely. "He's boring," she whispered. Her lips brushed the shell of my ear, a ghost of a touch that sent a shockwave down my spine. "But he's going to write you a check." I gripped the cold marble of the bar counter, my knuckles white. "How do you know?" "Because he can't stop looking at your projections," she murmured, not pulling back. Her breath was warm against my neck. "And because I told him you were a visionary." She pulled back then, just enough to look at me, a smirk playing on her lips. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was testing the perimeter, seeing if the electric fence was still live. It was. Then came the physical teasing, subtle enough to be plausible deniability, distinct enough to ruin me. We moved through the crowd to say goodbye to the board members. As we navigated the crush of bodies, I felt her hand settle on the small of my back. It wasn't the polite, guiding touch of a friend. It was firm, the heel of her palm pressing against the sensitive dip of my spine. Her fingers splayed possessively over the velvet of my suit. The heat of her hand seeped through the fabric, branding me. She guided me through the room, steering me with a pressure that was both gentle and absolute. I tried to maintain my composure. I nodded at the right times, shook hands, delivered the closing lines of my pitch. But my focus was gone. My entire world had narrowed down to the sensation of her hand on my back and the stark realization that I didn't want her to move it. I wanted to lean back into her touch. I wanted to abandon the investors and the penthouse and the pretense. As the crowd began to thin and the lights dimmed for the late-night mood, the safety of the public spectacle started to erode. We were running out of buffers. The noise dropped, the frantic energy of the party dissipated, and suddenly, there was nowhere left to hide from the shift in gravity. The car was waiting downstairs, and for the first time in 10 years of friendship, the thought of being alone with her unsettled me. The heavy door of the town car thudded shut, sealing us inside a hermetic bubble of soft leather. The chaotic noise of the gala was instantly cut off, replaced by the steady hum of the engine. It felt less like a ride home and more like entering a confessional booth, where the priest was also the sinner. It wasn't the comfortable silence of two friends tired after a long night. We had shared thousands of those, quiet rides where we scrolled through our phones or stared blankly out the window, secure in the knowledge that we didn't need to perform for each other. This silence was different. It was thick, viscous, weighted down by the word I had dropped back at the bar and the way she had picked it up. The word sweetheart seemed to be taking up all the oxygen in the back seat. The city streamed past outside, a blur of neon and sodium vapor. Streetlights sliced through the interior, illuminating her in strobes. Darkness, then the sharp line of her profile. Darkness, then the relaxed curve of her neck. She didn't look tired. She looked serene, almost predatory in her calmness, gazing out the window with a faint smile playing on her lips. She had taken off her heels, kicking them off onto the floor mat, and the casual intimacy of the gesture made my chest ache. The car banked sharp left onto the avenue. Gravity did the rest. My body slid, just an inch, but it was enough. My thigh pressed against hers. In any other timeline, one of us would have shifted. I would have apologized. She would have scooted toward the door. We would have reestablished the demilitarized zone of personal space. Tonight, neither of us moved. The contact point between our legs became the center of the universe. I could feel the warmth of her skin through the thin silk of her dress, burning against the wool of my trousers. It was a static charge, constant and unignorable. I stared straight ahead at the driver's headrest, terrified that if I looked at her, I would do something reckless, like take her hand. "Do you think you got what you wanted?" Her voice cut through the dark, low and smooth. She didn't turn her head. She was speaking to the window, to the reflection of us ghosted against the glass. I swallowed, my throat tight. The bridge round? Yes. Richard seems committed. The metrics held up. I wasn't talking about the money. She turned then, the movement slow and deliberate. The passing lights caught her eyes, making them glitter. I meant the risk. You always talk about calculated risks. High exposure, high reward. Did you get what you wanted? The subtext was so loud, it was deafening. She wasn't asking about the investors. She was asking about the slip. She was asking about the barrier I had accidentally demolished. My analytical brain, usually so good at parsing data and constructing narratives, short-circuited. There was no safe answer. No meant retreating, lying. Yes meant admitting that the slip wasn't an accident, but a confession. I don't know yet, I managed to say, the words feeling rough and inadequate. The data is incomplete. She made a small, thoughtful sound, shifting slightly so the pressure against my leg increased. It was a subtle escalation, a dare. Maybe you're just looking at the wrong data points. Sometimes the projection is obvious if you stop overthinking the variables. She let that hang in the air between us, a challenge wrapped in business jargon. She knew I was analyzing every micro-expression. She was banking on it. The car slowed, but I stayed anchored to her side. The quiet settled back in, vibrating now. I could feel her breathing, the slow rise and fall of her ribcage next to my arm. It stripped away the exhaustion of the party and left only a raw, nerve-ending awareness of her. The car pulled up to the curb. The engine idled. The driver cleared his throat, breaking the spell, but the tension didn't dissipate. It pooled in the back seat, thick, heavy, and unresolved, as the lock clicked open. I woke up with the specific, hollow ache of a hangover, despite having nursed a single glass of sparkling water for the last 2 hours of the gala. It wasn't the alcohol. It was the adrenaline crash, the somatic recoil of a body that had spent 6 hours in a state of hypervigilance. The sunlight hit the floorboards of my apartment with an accusatory brightness, too sharp, too real. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, and the memory of the night didn't filter in slowly. It crashed down all at once. The smell of her amber perfume, the heat of her hand on my spine, and the memory of the night echoing in the quiet room like a gunshot in a library. I rolled over and pressed my face into the pillow, groaning. The fear that washed over me was cold and absolute. It wasn't just embarrassment. I could handle embarrassment. I had pitched to venture capitalists with spinach in my teeth. I had frozen on stage during a panel. This was different. This was the terrifying realization that I might have taken a sledgehammer to the structural integrity of my life. Elena was my sanctuary. In a life governed by burn rates, investor expectations, and the relentless performance of success, she was the one place where I didn't have to be the founder. I could just be me. And with one careless, subconscious slip, I had potentially ruined the only safe harbor I had. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my hand hesitating before I tapped the screen. I expected silence. I expected her to give me a wide berth, to let the awkwardness settle into a wall we could both politely ignore until it calcified. There was a text. It had come in at 7:15 a.m. The data points are still incomplete. Coffee? I stared at the screen, my pulse jumping in my throat. It was casual on the surface, efficient, almost professional. But the timestamp betrayed her. 7:15 a.m. on a Sunday meant she hadn't slept well either. And the callback to our conversation in the car, the metaphor about data and risk, felt intimate, a private language she was refusing to let die. She wasn't letting it go. She was doubling down. I sat up, the sheets pooling around my waist. I looked around my apartment, the stacks of business journals, the half-finished prototypes on the desk, the ordered chaos of a life built around work. For 10 years, Elena had fit into this landscape as a distinct, separate entity. We had boundaries. We had rules. We discussed books, politics, her students, my stress. We did not discuss the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, or the fact that I had memorized the shape of her hands. Those things were kept in the vault, suppressed for the sake of the friendship. I tried to regain my footing. I made coffee, the routine of grinding beans and boiling water, usually soothing in its precision. I sat at my desk and opened the grant proposal I needed to review, determined to bury myself in the familiar anesthesia of work. I stared at the screen. The words were there: market penetration, scalability, user retention, but they meant nothing. My focus was entirely fractured. Every time I blinked, I felt the ghost of her touch. The sensation of her knuckles grazing my jaw was still there, a phantom burn on my skin. I couldn't focus on the revenue model because I was too busy replaying the way she had leaned into my space at the bar, the way she had looked at me in the car. It was gravity. I had been orbiting her for years, maintaining a stable, safe velocity, and now the orbit had decayed. I was falling. And the terrifying part was that I didn't want to pull up. My phone rang at noon. The sound shattered the silence, making me jump. It was her. I stared at the name on the screen for 3 full rings before answering. Hello? Stop staring at the grant proposal, she said. No preamble, no, hey, how are you? Her voice was low, stripped of its usual bright, teacherly cadence. It sounded rougher, like she had spent the morning smoking or whispering secrets. It sounded like the voice from the car. I'm not, I lied, closing the laptop. I'm cleaning. You're lying. You use the passive voice when you lie. I could hear the smile in her voice, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smirk from the bar. Meet me at the Roost, 30 minutes. Elena, Don't deflect, she cut in, soft but firm. We need to review the data. The line clicked dead before I could argue. I lowered the phone, my hand trembling slightly. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. We were going to a coffee shop, neutral ground, public, safe. But as I walked to the closet to get dressed, I knew it wasn't safe at all. It was a trap, and I was walking into it willingly. The Roost was usually my demilitarized zone. It was a cavernous, industrial space filled with the aggressive hiss of steam wands and the frantic typing of freelancers. For years, this had been our neutral ground, a place where the noise level was high enough to grant privacy, but the lighting bright enough to discourage intimacy. It was safe. Or it had been safe until I walked through the door at 12:30 and felt the immediate, visceral exposure of being watched. I spotted her instantly. She was seated at a small, wobbly table in the back corner, framed by a brick wall that had seen better decades. She looked different. At the gala, she had been a force of nature in silk. Here, in the harsh daylight of a Sunday afternoon, she looked softer, undone in a way that made my mouth go dry. She was wearing an oversized cashmere sweater the color of storm clouds, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, her hair pulled back in a messy knot that exposed the elegant, vulnerable line of her neck. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't reading. She was watching the door. And the moment I stepped in, her gaze locked onto me with a magnetic snap that I felt in my teeth. I ordered a black coffee to buy myself 30 seconds of composure. My hands were steady when I paid, a small victory of motor control over nervous system panic. Walking to the table felt like crossing a stage. "You're late," she said as I sat down. Her voice was warm, lacking the sharp edge from the phone call, but her eyes were still tracking me with that new, unsettling intensity. 3 minutes, I corrected, unwinding my scarf. The line was out the door. Inefficient. She pushed a scone toward me, blueberry, my favorite. She had ordered for me. The gesture was small, domestic, and disarmingly familiar. "Eat. You look like you're vibrating." We slipped into the well-worn grooves of our usual conversation, but the mechanism was broken. We talked about her department head's incompetence. We talked about the chaotic state of my inbox. But the rhythm was off. The pauses were too long, heavy with the things we weren't saying. I found myself acutely conscious of the way her fingers curled around her mug, the way she tilted her head when she listened. The easy, platonic banter that had sustained us for a decade felt thin now, a paper screen trying to hold back a flood. "You were different last night," she said suddenly, cutting through a monologue I was delivering about server costs. I froze, my coffee cup halfway to my mouth. Different how? I was stressed. It was a high-stakes room. "No." She shook her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "You're always stressed. That's your baseline. Last night you were present. You let the guard down. You let me in. I was drunk on adrenaline, Elena. And gratitude." "Is that what it was?" She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. The distance between us shrank. The noise of the coffee shop, the indie folk music, the shouting baristas seemed to drop away, leaving us in a vacuum of stillness. Because it felt like something else. It felt like you finally stopped pretending I was just part of the furniture. I set my cup down, careful not to let it clatter against the saucer. "You've never been furniture. You're the foundation. You know that. Foundation implies I'm structural. Necessary. But static." Her gaze dropped to my hand resting on the table, then traveled slowly back up to my face. It was a tactile look, a visual caress that felt heavier than physical touch. I don't want to be static anymore. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The air between us was thick, charged with the same voltage that had sparked in the car. I watched her take a sip of her tea, her eyes never leaving mine over the rim of the cup. She was challenging me to look away, to deflect, to run. Then she moved. She reached across the small, scarred table. I stopped breathing. I expected her to take my hand, but she didn't. Instead, her hand hovered near my wrist. Her fingers, cool and precise, brushed against the side of my hand. "You have a crumb," she whispered. She brushed a speck of blueberry from my knuckle. It was an innocent action, something a mother might do to a child, or a friend to a friend. But she didn't pull back. Her fingers lingered on my skin, tracing the line of a tendon, a feather-light touch that sent a shockwave straight to my core. She wasn't just cleaning me up. She was testing the boundary again. She was proving that she could touch me, that I would let her, that the electric fence was down and she was walking right through it. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. I stared at her hand on mine, then up at her face. Her expression was open, unflinching, a mix of amusement and raw hunger that unmoored me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't waiting for me to clarify the slip. She wasn't confused. She knew exactly what she wanted, and she was waiting for me to catch up. 3 days later, the theoretical boundary we had maintained for a decade evaporated in the span of a single heartbeat. She had come to my apartment to help edit the final grant proposal, a task that required 2 sets of eyes and, apparently, a complete suspension of our usual survival instincts. The setting was dangerously domestic. It was just past 11 on a Wednesday. The city outside was a low-frequency rumble, a backdrop of sirens and distant traffic that usually made me feel isolated. Tonight, however, the apartment felt hermetically sealed, pressurized by the presence of another person. We were surrounded by the debris of a working session, empty takeout containers smelling of basil and chili, half-empty mugs of tea that had gone cold, and the blue-white glare of 2 laptops acting as the only light source in the living room. We were working side by side on the leather couch. In the past, we would have sat at the dining table, upright and ergonomic, maintaining the geometry of colleagues. Tonight, we've collapsed onto the sofa. The leather was slippery, and gravity was conspiring against me. Every time I shifted to type a comment on the shared document, I slid imperceptibly closer to her. The professional pretense was paper thin, a transparent overlay on a reality that was becoming increasingly physical. I was trying to focus on the executive summary, but my peripheral vision was entirely occupied by her. She had pulled her legs up onto the cushions, her knees acting as a desk for her laptop. She was wearing reading glasses, which she almost never did in public, and the sight of them, perched on the end of her nose, making her look severe and incredibly academic, did something complicated to my ability to process the English language. I typed a sentence. I deleted it. I typed it again. "You've rewritten that paragraph 4 times, she said. Her voice was soft, barely rising above the hum of the refrigerator. She didn't look up from her screen. "It's the methodology section," I murmured, staring blindly at the cursor. "It needs to be precise." "It's fine. You're overthinking it." I turned to look at her, intending to argue the merits of precise methodology. The words died in my throat. She wasn't looking at her screen anymore. She was looking at me. Her head was tilted against the back of the couch, her glasses reflecting the blue light, but behind the lenses, her eyes were dark and focused. It wasn't the warm, supportive look of a friend. It was a look of calculation. She was watching me the way an architect studies a load-bearing wall, looking for the stress fractures, estimating how much weight it would take to bring the whole thing down. "What?" I asked. My voice sounded rough in the quiet room. "Nothing," she lied. She didn't look away. I turned back to my computer, my pulse thumping a frantic rhythm against my wrist rest. I reached for the mouse at the same moment she reached for her tea mug. Our movements were unsynchronized, but inevitable. My shoulder brushed against hers. It wasn't a collision. It was a connection. The contact point, the curve of my deltoid against the soft wool of her sweater, instantly became the hottest thing in the room. We both froze. The typing stopped. The city noise seemed to cut out, leaving us suspended in a vacuum of sudden, absolute awareness. I could have stepped back. The moment was still reversible. But her warmth seeping into my arm made that choice impossible. I could feel the heat of her arm seeping through the layers of our clothes. I could feel the shallow rise and fall of her breath. The silence stretched, heavy and viscous, wrapping around us like a physical weight. I slowly turned my head. Her face was inches from mine. She hadn't pulled back. If anything, she had leaned in, pressing the point of contact firmer, turning an accident into a choice. "You know," she said, her voice dropping to a register that vibrated in my chest, "the way you handle this, the stress, the pressure, the obsession with getting every word right." She paused. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then tracked slowly back up to my eyes. It was unflinching. "It's attractive," she finished. There was zero irony in her tone, no joking deflection, just a raw, simple statement of fact delivered with the precision of a scalpel. The air in the room changed instantly. The grant proposal, the investors, the deadlines, it all dissolved. The atmosphere charged, thick and heavy with a sudden, suffocating intimacy. The work was forgotten. The only thing that existed was the woman on my couch who was looking at me like she was waiting for permission to stop pretending. "Elena," I breathed, a warning or a plea. I wasn't sure. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't tell me I'm wrong." She didn't move her shoulder. Neither did I. The gallery opening in Chelsea 2 nights later was a different universe from the corporate penthouse. If the gala had been a study in rigid structures and calculated risks, this was all fluid lines and chaotic potential. The space was a raw industrial cavern, the walls stark white, the floors polished concrete, the air thick with the scent of cheap white wine and expensive pretension. The crowd here didn't care about burn rates or user acquisition. They moved with a loose kinetic energy, drifting between large-scale abstract canvases that looked like bruised skin. Here, the power dynamic inverted. In the boardroom, I was the sun she orbited, the one with the title and the burden of gravity. But here, among the artists and the critics, Elena was the celestial body. She moved through the room with an effortless ease, her usual teacherly warmth replaced by a sharp, worldly sophistication. She wore a black dress that was deceptively simple, cut low enough in the back to expose the spine I had felt against my arm in the car. She didn't walk beside me. She led me. She was bolder tonight. Perhaps it was the setting, which rewarded performance, or perhaps it was the wine she had been sipping with steady deliberation. She introduced me to people, a curator with silver rings, a poet who wouldn't stop staring at my mouth. But she didn't introduce me as a founder. She introduced me simply by my name, stripping away the professional armor I usually wore. And with every introduction, she touched me. It was possessive. There was no other word for it. Her hand rested on my forearm as she spoke, her fingers curling slightly into the fabric of my silk blouse. When we moved to the next painting, her hand drifted to the small of my back, guiding me, steering me. It wasn't the supportive touch of a friend ensuring I didn't get lost in the crowd. It was the proprietary touch of someone who knows exactly what belongs to them. The catalyst for the night's final escalation arrived in the form of a sculptor named Julian. He was charming in a disheveled, intentional way, and he decided within 30 seconds that he wanted to know me. He cornered me near a sculpture made of twisted rebar, turning his back on the room to create a private pocket of space. He leaned in too close, his voice dropping to that intimate register men use when they think they've found an opening. He asked about my work, but his eyes were tracking the line in my throat. I was polite. I was trying to formulate a graceful exit, but before I could speak, Elena materialized. She didn't say a word initially. She didn't have to. The shift in her demeanor was instantaneous and sharp as a knife edge. She stepped into the negative space between Julian and me, effectively breaking his line of sight. She didn't look at him with anger. She looked at him with a serene, absolute dismissal. She turned her back to him completely, focusing her entire attention on me, boxing me in against the pedestal of the sculpture. "You look bored," she murmured, her voice low and rough. She ignored Julian entirely, treating him like background noise. "I'm not bored," I lied, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I'm just—" "You are." She stepped closer. We were now violating every social norm of personal space in a public room. "You have that look you get when you're trying to be polite to someone you don't want to talk to." Then came the touch that shattered the last remnant of my composure. Her hand slid from my elbow down to my waist. It didn't stop there. Her thumb pressed into the soft curve of my side, tracing the seam of my blouse in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. It was a claim. It was a silent, physical declaration that echoed the word I had slipped days ago. She was staking out territory. Julian, realizing he had walked into a crossfire he didn't understand, mumbled an excuse and drifted away. Elena didn't even watch him go. Her eyes were locked on mine, dark and heavy with intent. Her thumb continued that slow, maddening stroke against my waist, burning through the silk. "We should go," she said, not a question. "Before I do something we can't walk back from in public." The ride to her apartment was a blur of streetlights and heavy silence. We didn't speak because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't detonate the fragile reality we were clinging to. When the taxi pulled up to her brownstone, the polite fiction that I was just dropping her off dissolved without a vote. I paid the driver and followed her up the steps, watching her unlock the door with a hand that was unnervingly steady, while mine shook in my pockets. Inside, the apartment was a vault. It was quiet. Not the empty quiet of absence, but the heavy, expectant quiet of a stage before the curtain rises. The air smelled of her, old paper, dried lavender, and that sharp, lingering scent of amber. She didn't turn on the overhead lights. She left the hallway in shadows, illuminated only by the street lamp filtering through the sheer curtains, casting distorted shapes across the floorboards. She dropped her keys in the bowl. The metallic clatter sounded like a judge's gavel falling. She turned to face me, leaning back against the entryway table, crossing her arms over her chest. She wasn't taking off her heavy wool coat. She wasn't offering tea. She was waiting. The silence was heavy, expectant. I tried to break it the only way I knew how, with deflection. "Well," I said, my voice sounding thin in the dark hallway. "That was intense. I didn't know you had a bodyguard mode. Remind me never to cross you in a dark alley." It was a weak, desperate joke. Elena didn't smile. She just watched me, her eyes dark and heavy. The silence that followed my attempt at humor was excruciating. "Stop," she said softly. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. "Stop what?" "Stop performing." She pushed off the table and took a step toward me. "You've been performing all week. At the coffee shop, at your apartment, tonight with Julian. I was handling a situation. That's what I do. Is that what this is? A situation?" She tilted her head, studying me with unwavering focus. "Because it feels like you're terrified." "I'm not terrified." "You are. I can see the pulse in your neck." I instinctively raised a hand to my throat, covering the betrayal, then dropped it. I looked away, unable to hold her gaze. "Did you mean it?" she asked. The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. She didn't specify what it was. She didn't have to. The implication was still floating between us, the ghost haunting every interaction for 5 days. I opened my mouth to lie. I wanted to say it was a slip, a byproduct of stress. I wanted to retreat to the safety of the platonic box where we had lived comfortably for 10 years. If I lied, we could go back. We could stay safe. "Elena," I started, my voice trembling. "We've been friends for a decade. You know how important you are to me. I don't want to risk the only stable thing in my life for a moment of confusion." "Is that what you think this is? Confusion?" "I think the lines are blurry right now. We're both tired." "I'm not tired," she countered, her voice dropping an octave. "And I'm not confused." She stepped closer. The distance between us was now measured in inches. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, smell the wine on her breath. I backed up until my shoulders hit the wall. There was nowhere left to go. I was pinned between the plaster and the woman who knew me better than I knew myself. "You didn't answer the question," she whispered. She placed a hand on the wall next to my head, boxing me in. It was a cage made of choice. "Did you mean it?" I looked at her then, really looked at her. I saw the fear in her eyes that mirrored my own, but also a resolve I lacked. She wasn't letting me run. She was demanding the one thing I had never given her, the unvarnished truth. "If I say yes," I whispered, my heart hammering like a trapped bird, "everything changes. We can't go back." "I don't want to go back," she said, her gaze dropping to my lips. "I hate back. I want forward." The verbal dance was over. There were no more jokes to make, no more deflections to throw. There was only the narrow space between our bodies and the terrifying, exhilarating precipice of the truth. "It wasn't a slip," I said, the words feeling jagged and raw as they finally left my throat. "It was a leak." "A leak?" She didn't blink. Her hand remained on the wall, a barrier and an invitation, trapping me in the heat of the moment. "My filter failed. I called you sweetheart because that is what my brain calls you when I stop editing the transcript, when I'm too tired to maintain the firewall." I took a breath that shuddered in my chest, the admission terrifying in its irreversibility. "I didn't call you that to be patronizing. I called you that because for 3 years I've been watching you fix my life while I pretend we're just colleagues who share a Netflix password and occasional takeout." I saw her eyes widen slightly in the shadows. The confession was pouring out now, unbidden, a torrent of suppressed data crashing through the carefully constructed dam of our friendship. "I wanted to say it at the gala," I continued, my voice gaining a desperate strength. "I wanted to say it in the car when your leg pressed against mine and I felt like I was burning alive. I wanted to say it when you cleaned my hand at the coffee shop. I was terrified that if I acknowledged the voltage between us, the whole circuit would blow. I thought I'd lose the friendship if I asked for more. I thought silence was the price of keeping you. Elena let out a breath that sounded like a structural release. The tension in her shoulders dropped. The predatory, calculating focus she had worn all week softened into something raw and unguarded. A small, incredulous laugh escaped her throat, a sound of pure relief that vibrated in the small space between us. "You calculator," she whispered, shaking her head, a smile touching her lips that was entirely devoid of irony. "You absolute idiot." She moved her hand from the wall to my face. Her palm was cool against my flush skin, her thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone with a reverence that made my knees weak. "You think you're the only one terrified? I've been orbiting you for months, terrified that I was reading the signals wrong. I thought I was projecting. I thought you just needed a friend, and I was the one making it complicated by wanting to be the only person you looked at." "You didn't make it complicated," I murmured, leaning into her touch, surrendering to the gravity. "You made it real." "Good." Her gaze dropped to my mouth again, and this time there was no hesitation, no testing of boundaries. "Because I'm done being careful. I'm done with the orbit." She closed the final distance. The first contact was tentative, a question asked in the language of breath and skin. Her lips brushed mine, soft and hesitant, giving me one last fraction of a second to retreat to the safety of the platonic, to laugh it off and run. I didn't retreat. I reached out, gripping the lapels of her heavy wool coat, anchoring myself to her. I pulled her closer, collapsing the remaining space. The kiss deepened instantly. It wasn't the cinematic, polite kiss of a romance novel. It was desperate. It tasted of wine and years of silence and the terrifying relief of a barrier finally shattering. It was messy and urgent. The tension that had been strangling us for a week snapped, replaced by a heat that flooded my entire system. It felt like falling and being caught at the same time. The world outside the hallway, the investors, the gallery, the expectations, ceased to exist. There was only the pressure of her mouth, the slide of her hands into my hair, and the overwhelming realization that the friendship hadn't ended. It had ignited. We stumbled back, away from the wall, without breaking contact. The fear of ruining things dissolved in the heat of the moment. We weren't breaking the sanctuary. We were expanding it. The intimacy we had shared as friends, the trust, the shorthand, the history, wasn't lost. It was the fuel for this new fire. When we finally pulled apart, gasping for air in the dim hallway, the silence returned. But it wasn't heavy anymore. It was resonant. She rested her forehead against mine, her hands still framing my face, her breathing matching the frantic rhythm of my own. "Okay?" she asked, her voice rough, stripped of all pretense. "Yeah," I whispered, opening my eyes to see her smiling at me in the dark. "Better than okay." "Good," she said, and pulled me back in. "Because we have a lot of data points to catch up on." Morning light filters through her curtains now, sharp and revealing. It illuminates the new landscape of us. Messier, riskier, but infinitely more real. The pretense is gone, leaving only the foundation we always had. There is no going back to the safety of the before, and looking at her sleeping beside me, I realize I never want to. If you understand the risk of crossing that line, subscribe for more stories.